Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Mel. I'm the president of the IABC Queensland chapter, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land on which we are on today. I myself am on Yagara and Turrbal country here in Meanjin, also known as Brisbane. And I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to and acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today or who are watching this recording later. And again, perhaps in the chat, you'd like to tell us which country you're joining us from today. So super excited about today's session. It's very relevant for organizations all over the world, no matter what size, type, shape, what products you offer, what services you offer. Unfortunately, the reality is we are all very much at risk of being victims of cyber security incidents or just cyber incidents in general, as it turns out from last week. So I'm super excited to have Megan Lane here. Megan and I met last year talking on a panel about cybersecurity and crisis communication. And I was so impressed by everything she has to say in this realm. So, Megan, we might just start with very quickly if you could share a little bit about who you are and a little bit about CyberCX.
Thanks so much. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for setting time out in your day, particularly at this point in the year, when I think everyone here would probably prefer to be on holiday somewhere warmer, unless, of course, you're joining us from Queensland, where it's quite warm enough. My name's Megan Lane, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications here at CyberCX. It's a dual-hatted role, so like a lot of people on this call, I sit partly in our corporate affairs team. I'm our head of media and government affairs, but I also have the privilege of leading out our strategic communications team, or as people probably know it better, our crisis communications team. We're the team that usually you meet at 4 o'clock on a Friday, which was obviously not a joke last Friday for a number of people. Or on a Sunday morning as organisations grapple with the fallout at the beginning of a cybersecurity incident. Our team sits inside of CyberCX, which is Australia's largest Australian cybersecurity firm, 1,400 people across Australia, New Zealand, the UK and the US, but primarily based in Australia, about just over 1,000 people based here in Oz. My background, I joined CyberCX following roughly 10 years in politics, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But relevantly to this team, spent a good chunk of time working in Queensland, both for Stephen Miles and for Jim Chalmers. So my background kind of comes in that sort of like political media sort of communication space.
Brilliant. Well, we're very excited to have you here today. And the way we're going to run today's session is a bit of a virtual fireside chat. So I will be peppering Megan with lots of questions. If you have questions throughout, and I really hope you do, please pop them in the chat and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can by the end of the session. Okay, so first question, let's start with some of the hard stuff, shall we? What are some of the types of cybersecurity incidents that you're seeing happen most frequently?
Thanks, Mel. It's a great question and a great place to start, because I'm conscious that almost everybody here hopefully won't have had to endure a major cybersecurity incident and are not technical people. I know everyone will have the CrowdStrike outage on their minds from Friday, and I expect that's where the Q&A we'll get to a bit later today. But I suppose the types of cyber incidents that require like a significant communications response that our teams are most often pulled onto are those that involve ransomware and data theft. The word ransomware gets thrown around a lot in the biz and also by media to describe any kind of number of cybersecurity events. But like for us who kind of deal with it on like a day in, day out basis, what we think about when we hear ransomware is an incident where a threat actor, and like forgive me because there are all of these like expressions that get used in cybersecurity that get used like nowhere else on earth, but like a threat actor who has access to your IT environment deploys like malicious software, so software generally that they have written, which is designed to lock up or encrypt your systems. And then what happens is your systems just simply stop working, and that's where that kind of movie style like skull and crossbones on a screen tends to come from, is where those systems have been locked up and ransom notes get put on everybody's computer. So it's like a ransomware event that kind of brings a business to a crashing halt. The other type of kind of key incident where we spend a lot of our time is data theft. does what it says on the tin. Like a threat actor accesses your environment, steals information that is valuable to you, so that they can extort you over it. It used to be that those two things happen sort of separately, but more and more we see them happening together. So ransomware and data theft occurring together. And here's like another buzzword for you. In the biz, they refer to that as like double extortion. That's because threat actors have two ways that they can convince you to pay out. I suppose that for both of these types of incidents, particularly where we're talking about criminal groups, really what they're motivated by and what they're after is a financial outcome. It's a ransom payment. In the case of ransomware, what you're paying for is a decryption key, something that will unlock or unpick your systems and allow your business to get back to BAU. And in the case of data theft, it's about the data they've stolen, not like giving them a reason not to release it or unsell it or publish it on the dark web. It's probably worth noting that while we spend most of our time dealing with organisations who are responding to criminal groups, it's not just criminal groups in this space. We respond to cyber incidents involving foreign nation states and also like malicious insiders, so people who are employed inside of a business or contractors who are employed inside of a business, both of which call for very different communications responses and also like very different responses from stakeholders, particularly in government and regulators. So it's a bit of an outline.
So what's a DNS then?
Like a denial of service attack. Yeah. So denial of service or DDoS or DOS attacks were probably like the way that most people, I think, probably became aware like of cybersecurity events. You may remember at the 2016 census when no one could log in. There was some speculation in the public arena that the reason that no Australian could log into the census was because of a DDoS attack. And I think the minister said it, not knowing what that meant, and Australians heard it, not knowing what that meant, and discovered that actually a criminal group hadn't been responsible for that. It was just like 16 million Australians attempting to log into the census portal at exactly the same time. But a denial of service attack essentially looks not unlike 16 million Australians trying to log into a single gateway at once. It is where a piece of code is written that floods a website or a system, that brings the website or the system like crashing down and keeps it down. Again, either by a threat actor group either looking for an extortion payment, or like this is not a tactic not uncommonly used by hacktivists, so a portmanteau of hacker and activist, where they're seeking to really draw attention, I suppose, to an organisation. They do it as a piece of theatre, but those are sort of like less common, I suppose, here in Australia. We see them, but they tend to be geared at like politically sensitive or like high media sort of target organisations. Like we sometimes speak to hospitals and they say like, are we likely to be subject to a DDoS attack? I'm like, look, between you and a coal mine, like I'd be betting on the coal mine having a DDoS issue and sort of not you. So yeah, different organisations and businesses in Australia and government attract different types of threat actors depending on the type of information they hold and how likely and how perceived likely they are to like have the opportunity to pay a ransom, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So they're the types of things we should be aware of, but where do you even start in preparing and planning for responding to a cyber incident?
Totally. So probably about like once or twice a week, our team gets a call from a really well-meaning member of a technical team in an organization who says, like, I reckon we are pretty good to go on the technical side. Like we're ready for the inevitable cyber incident whenever that comes. But I reckon we need a cyber crisis communications plan. And I'm like, that is so interesting and very thoughtful of you. Do you have a crisis comms plan? And usually, sorry to people on Scholar, usually it's a him. He says, yes. But it's not specific enough to cyber security. And I suppose like the kind of education piece that we've been doing in market at the moment is there's no point in having a perfect cyber crisis communications plan that isn't actually your crisis communications plan, because what people don't want to be doing in the middle of a crisis is trying to flex or exercise a new muscle or a new process that sort of doesn't get exercised or practiced in other places. And so what we say instead is like the first thing you should do, like if you sort of leave this call at the end of the day and you only do one thing, like go and have a look at your crisis comms plan and ask yourself, like, is this robust enough for cyber. Usually crisis comms plans are written during or just after a crisis, when people say, gee, I wish we'd sort of done that in a slightly more...
Hello, COVID-19.
Yeah,
Yep.
well, exactly. And so we see a lot of crisis comms plans were written during COVID or last updated during COVID. And so that means there's a lot of everyone can work from home. We'll all get onto Teams, we'll collaborate through like our Microsoft environment. But as we've experienced, it's not uncommon for threat actors to have access to that part of the environment. And we've had cyber criminals join Teams calls
Wow.
where groups are discussing a cyber incident. So there's sort of like things like that, like particularly in the ways of working piece and like how and why a crisis comms team comes together, or a comms team generally comes together at the beginning of an incident, which where crisis comms plans, as they are currently documented, can let people down, partly because it's usually there's sort of like key things that are set out around like how, when, and why does a comms team come together? Like it's because a crisis has been declared, but cyber incidents can like start very quietly, very quietly, very quietly, and then really escalate. And where we see the biggest mistakes made in a cyber incident, actually in that early phase, where like it's really unclear what's going on. Like maybe this is a cyber incident, maybe it's not. We haven't sort of realized the effects of it yet. Maybe ransomware hasn't actually been deployed in the environment yet. Maybe we've just got like unauthorized access to our environment, and people put some really unhelpful like language together around, oh no, it's not a cyber incident, it's just technical outage, planned maintenance, and like all sorts of weird and wonderful versions of that kind of statement that we've seen flying around in recent years. And actually what you want to do is be able to stand up your comms team much earlier. Like don't wait for the P1 crisis, like be pulling those people together much sooner and empowering them to start pulling that narrative piece together. So I think like making sure that you're really clear in your process around how you come together, what powers whoever calls that group together has to pull people together earlier in an incident. Don't wait for the crisis. Who's on your crisis comms team, and how have you bedded in like the technical view? So sometimes people say to me, oh, well, we would have a comms person like in the room with the technical people. And I'm like, that is so well-meaning and so unhelpful, because tech people speak a whole nother language during cyber incident crisis mode. And so what you really want is like making room in your planning to have a technical person on the comms team like that really allows you to fly much faster. Thinking through your backup channels, and then obviously building your stakeholder map. So what we do tend to see as like an appendice usually to a crisis comms plan, it's like a list of stakeholders an organization would have to work through, but it's usually like quite high level, and it talks about categories of stakeholders as opposed to stakeholders specifically. And what you really want, like this is like gold plated, if everyone on this team had not just time to like do a review of their crisis comms plan and uplift that, but like had a few spare days up their sleeve and like nothing on, you'd have a look at your stakeholder mapping, and you'd say, right, well, who are my stakeholders, and like what is my legal and regulatory obligation to every stakeholder on this list, and like what are my key contractual obligations to every stakeholder on this list, and then like what is the overarching or strategic imperative that drives the way that I engage with that stakeholder. And so a good example of this is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, a stakeholder who like most people on this call have not had reason to interact with. There are all sorts of different limits around, some people have to disclose the ACSC within 12 hours. Some people have to disclose within 72 hours. Some people never have to disclose unless they feel like it, right? So there's different regimes that sit around your obligation to disclose. There'll be no contractual obligation, but on the strategic side, absolutely every single stakeholder, we want to hear that you've spoken to the ACSC, or that you've spoken to, if you're in the state government, the cybersecurity unit in the Queensland government. They form like a necessary first step in your disclosure regime if you're going to go external with comms about the fact that you're responding to a cybersecurity incident. And this is the beginning of what I like. sometimes people refer to like the theatre of incident response, and it's like hands-on keyboards and people in rack rooms, like ripping internet cables out of things. People on this call are professionals in what I call like the jazz hands theatre of incident response. It's kind of understanding that some people want to hear first and other people just want to know they heard before those folks, but after these people. Yeah. And so like going through and being really clear about like all of those obligations allows you to design like as best you can ahead of time, like your waterfall. Because what you don't want is the legal team executing a little mini waterfall, and then the commercial team executing a little mini waterfall, and then your social media team executing a little mini waterfall. What you want is one organization wide, like an enterprise disclosure waterfall that allows everyone to like claim their place and like manage that theatre of disclosure. And so while the lowest hanging fruit is making sure that your crisis comms plan is fit for purpose and robust. And like Mel made a tongue-in-cheek joke earlier about like no one's got the resources they need. No one has the resources they need for this, right? So making sure that you've made a claim internally about like how many people you will need and what you will need them to do to support your communications and stakeholder approach. Like that's the low-hanging fruit stuff. The bigger burn, but much more impactful piece is that stakeholder mapping piece. So I feel like I've like gone on a rant there, but those are probably the two biggest pieces of effort.
No, that's great. And when we spoke prior to this call, you talked about insurances and having to be aware of those. And that is something I don't think a lot of people do think about. Can you give us a little bit more on what that looks like and maybe an example?
Do we mean insurers?
Yes. Yeah.
Insurers? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It is more and more common for organizations to have like cyber insurance. But even where they don't have cyber insurance, they've got like business continuity insurance. And it's not uncommon to hear that legal teams or the sort of insurance folks inside an organization are at the beginning of a cyber incident trying to work out like what may or may not be covered. And then like what you need to do at the beginning of an incident to make sure that if you choose to make a claim later, that you've not kind of like done something early on that makes that really difficult. What insurers tend to do is let an organisation crack on, particularly on the comms front. But what they do tend to do is appoint like some legal representatives, a law firm, to act on their behalf and represent the interests of the law firm into an organisation.
Right.
So it's key to make sure that you're clear when we were talking before about the plan and like the resources you'll need. One of the things that we usually look for in a plan is like, what's your drafting, clearance and distribution process? Our distribution process is ticked off by the stakeholder map generally. But the drafting and clearance process, like where does external legal sit inside your process map, and is that accounted for? And so being really clear about like the appetite of your insurer's legal firm around like where they like to get involved and what kind of say they like to have. If you've got insurance, then you can find out now who your external legal provider is, and you can have a conversation with them now about sort of what those expectations are. Like forewarned is forearmed, right? And just making sure that when we talk about the theatre of incident response, theatre of incident response is outwards looking, there's theatre of incident response is inward looking too. And it's just a case of making sure that everyone feels like they've had a chance to have their say, even if we don't reach consensus, because we all know about comms, if you try to put everything in, people take nothing out. So like stick to your guns on the strategic side, but it's about making sure that people have comfort.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. So when an incident happens, what is the first thing you should do?
People on this call will be lucky enough one day probably to get a call from their Chief Information Security Officer, their CISO, or their CIO, or their Head of Corporate Affairs, depending on sort of where people sit, and they'll be told that you're experiencing a cybersecurity incident. The first question I would ask if I'm in the comms team or leading a comms team is like, who knows? Because it's not uncommon at the beginning of a cybersecurity incident for the circle of trust to be very, very small as people try to work out like the blast radius and whether or not this is going to escalate. It's very unusual for a cyber incident to start loud. It usually starts quiet and goes loud. And so at that moment, you're having a look at your crisis comms plan. You're like, these 5 people are in my crisis comms plan to support me executing a comms strategy, but like, do they know already? And am I allowed to brief people and bring them in, or am I doing this on my own? And it's not uncommon for senior comms folks to be told like, well, actually, we don't want you to bring your team in. Like, actually, just it has to be you on your own. So that's the first thing. The second thing, obviously, is to get a briefing about what has happened and what steps have been taken internally, and what might happen next, and get a bit of a sense from the technical folks about like, where's their risk appetite at? Like, is this contained or uncontained? And where might this be going next? At that point, I would usually say to people, like, you should ask for help. No one on this call is expected to be like, no one on this call, I don't think, unless I've misunderstood the brief about who is coming, is a professional like in managing technology crisis. And if you're in the Queensland government, the cybersecurity unit, they have people like not unlike me, who sit there and are there to provide that support and strategic guidance and playbooks to Queensland government organisations. And if you are if you have like, established relationships with PR firms, or you have established relationships with GR firms, like I would be thinking about like pulling those people in at that point. If you're not allowed to tell your own teams, instead thinking about how you can buy in that bandwidth, because like the work for comms in a cyber incident looks a bit like this. There's like a massive burn for 2 to 3 days, and then it like dies off. And then there's like a moderate burn, usually at the 5 to 7 day mark. But that first 3 days is like some of the hardest you'll work, as you seek to like build the willingness internally to communicate about this, mapping your stakeholders in anger, building the waterfall, negotiating the waterfall with your own colleagues, renegotiating the waterfall with your own colleagues. Oh God, now the technical facts have moved. I had to redraft the comms. Yeah. And so like that 2 to 3 day period at the beginning, like that's where you need like that big surge support.
Okay. So what does good look like?
Aha. Now, Mel, we have
here's something we prepared earlier. So, very spontaneous, this chat. Here we go.
All right. So earlier I said good crisis communications plans. So good cyber crisis communications plans are good crisis comms plans. Like what good looks like in managing like a technology or a cyber incident essentially is underpinned by what most people here know to be good, like the sort of foundational principles of crisis comms. And this is sort of like my version of this. I know that every practitioner has their own kind of like version of what good looks like. But at risk of telling colleagues who are just as experienced as me how to suck eggs, I thought we might just sort of talk about some of these and give some examples of people who've managed to achieve this and other people where it hasn't. It can feel really Pollyanna to discuss like avoiding some of these pitfalls when the sun is shining outside. But like over and over again, we do seem to find people who sort of trip up on some of this stuff. So I suppose the first rule of crisis comms is provide factual information. And I suppose this can be written in 2 ways. The first is like, don't lie, which of course is the sort of first rule of all comms. But I think the days of like, systems are down for scheduled maintenance when it's actually a full-blown cyber incident are largely behind us. We used to get comms like that to review about once every 2 weeks, and now we get it every 6 weeks. So like the message is getting out there that if you tell people things are down for scheduled maintenance at no notice, the first question people will ask is like, well, actually, like, what's going on here? The second piece is around not reaching for comfort too early. So probably the sort of most high profile example of this would be that first press release from Medibank, where they made a commitment around how at this point in time or at this time, we don't believe any data has been accessed or stolen. And that is a factual statement, but it provided like an unhelpful level of comfort to people at the beginning of the crisis that sort of then had to be managed as the incident continued to evolve. And I suppose like while it was accurate, like was unhelpful, and yeah, and it's that comfort piece. And I think what I'd say is like I've never seen a client act maliciously at the beginning of an incident where they're sort of like, I can just like pull the rug over people's eyes. Like that's never been the intent. It has always been driven by a desire to like provide comfort and be like a place of safe harbor in an incident, I suppose. That speaks really well to them as individuals and as people. But leaning away from that at the beginning of a crisis is so key. The second piece here is about being the central source of truth. And for me, that's all about making sure that people hear bad news from you directly. And that like where some people might make an offer to speak to others on your behalf, you should always seek to make sure that a representative from your organization is there and is able to represent your narrative and your equities. Because like it's strategically beneficial to do that, but also key always to be seen to front up, and we'll get a bit more into that in the second pillar. This last piece here around using simple terminology, my view is if my mother couldn't understand it, my mum has to ring me to ask her to reset her Amazon password, which is obviously super cyber secure. If my mother couldn't understand, it's got no business being in the sort of public facing comms during a cyber incident. And so even things that don't sound super technical, like MFA and 2FA, like those are things that senior executives and others can get really tripped up on later. To say absolutely nothing of like the repeated request to include expressions like brute force attack and like hypervisor in comms, which seems to be something that I'm just on like an individual and personal mission to kill. Sort of helpful for people to understand that it's not uncommon for a cyber incident to begin with a brute force attack, and a brute force attack is just a really aggressive way of telling people that a threat actor has just tried an awful lot of combinations of passwords and usernames over and over and over again in rapid succession until they found one that clicked through your login gateway and allowed someone to access your environment. Where do these usernames and passwords come from? You know, every time you go onto your iPhone and it's like yet more of your passwords have been caught up in a data breach. People can buy like spreadsheets of usernames and passwords on the dark web, and then they use them, they weaponize them, and they throw them at login sort of screens and just see, because obviously we all reuse passwords over and over again. I mean, obviously I don't, because I work at a cybersecurity company, I will never do that. But like, you know, hypothetically, if one did that, yeah, if you reuse passwords, that could make systems vulnerable in other places. What do people think of when you say brute force attack though? They think of that scene in Lord of the Rings where like all of the orcs are at the gate and they're trying to bust the gate down. And that is like so unhelpful, right? Because what it does, it destroys trust. Because that's not the image, right, you want to talk about. But you'll be under pressure from your technical and legal colleagues to describe things accurately, even if that doesn't meet like your strategic objective. And so I suppose over the course of a cyber incident, there are sort of three types of risk, right? They're all trying to balance. Got strategic risk, which is like our domain. Technical risk, right? Because it's hard. It's like a technically led challenge. And then you've got legal risk. And it's not right over the course of an incident for any one risk to dominate the others. All of them need to be in what I call like healthy tension. Or as I heard a new expression the other week from someone, just sounds like awful consultant speak, but like good challenge. So you want all three of those to be in like healthy tension. So that way you kind of like modulate each other out. But like that's where that translation piece is where comms is so key, and particularly where the need to be like overly simple is so important. This next thing around being proactive and deliberate approach, like this is all about choosing your own destiny, I suppose, in the course of an incident. Like it's really tempting at the beginning of a cyber incident. We get the question a lot, like, do we ever have to tell anyone about this? Like if there's been no data theft, could we just like never tell anyone? And this is from like listed companies or people that have like actual legal obligations to disclose regardless of a data breach. And usually I say like, it's going to get out. Like you are dealing with a criminal group who's got a dark web website where like most people on this call like have something to do with managing the websites of their own organization. And usually somewhere on the website, there's like a bunch of logos of like all the organizations you work with. Cyber criminals do the same thing, but they're all the logos of people that they've managed to extort or steal information from. Yeah. And so like journalists monitor those pages, government monitor those pages, like word is going to get out that you've had a problem. And so if you know that in like 7 days, 21 days, 30 days, 60 days, it's more likely than not that a threat actor will post about you on their dark web and it will come into the public arena. If you imagine yourself in like 30 days and you look back and like today you're at day one, like when do you wish you disclosed a cyber incident, started bringing stakeholders on that journey? Like usually the answer is like today or tomorrow, whenever you can kind of like get comms through your clearance process. And so we always say to people, like it feels negligent with a brand to go public with bad news, and it should feel negligent, right? Like get out of bed every day. We're comms and brand professionals. Like our job is to build and protect the brand of the organization we work for. So if you don't feel negligent, you don't care enough. But like ultimately you're actually doing yourself and the organization a favor in seizing that strategic high ground, setting the narrative and like owning it. And that goes to the importance of taking ownership. Sometimes there's a desire to like sheet the blame and point the finger, particularly if the incident has begun because you have like an outsourced IT provider who maybe hadn't like got all of their house in order and has facilitated access into your environment that's then triggered a cyber incident. And I always say at the beginning of a cyber incident, like, who are the victims of a cyber incident? Like, not you. Like, particularly if you're an organization that holds data about like people like in the community at large, like they are the real victims, and they are the victims that the media and others will focus on and regulators will focus on. And so at the beginning of an incident, you don't want to be seen to be putting yourself at the center of it. You want to be seen to be like the most altruistic and responsible incident responder you possibly can be. This next week, I'll sort of fly through these now because I'm conscious of time. This next piece around providing timely responses and updates. I don't know if anyone else did this during COVID, but I was one of those people who sat and watched like every single premiere every single day, like back to back for hours, like an actual psychopath. And what was clear to me, like as a comms person, is that there was like a formula being like etched into the mind of Australians about what good media fronting and comms updates look like. And that is like stand in the same spot every day, you know, like take all of the questions whenever they're asked, but come out at the same time every single day with an update. And so it can be this real desire just to make that commitment, particularly if you're in government or a high profile business. So if you're either like critical infrastructure, got a large B2C footprint, or you're listed, this desire to say like, we'll be back here tomorrow at 2 or we'll be back here tomorrow at 11 with an update. And I would just say to people, like, don't make that commitment. Commit to people that you will come back and provide more updates as you learn more. But all you do, if you commit to coming back every single day, is like, I've seen it happen an hour before the deadline, someone running around being like, has anyone got anything we can say? Which is like, not strategy leading tactics. That is like tactics leading strategy. Yeah. And so like, just like, again, like leaning away from the comfort piece at the beginning of an incident and giving yourself as much flexibility as possible to continue to respond. Accepting and operating in ambiguity, like these things move very quickly and then they slow down a lot and then they'll move quickly again, and things that you thought were fact maybe aren't fact. And that's not just like, has data been accessed or stolen? That can even be things like, was there like a password on the VPN that everyone uses to log into the environment? And everyone goes, well, obviously there must be. I'm just not a technical person, so I didn't understand how that worked. And then maybe it turns out it wasn't, right? So like not only facts about the incident itself, but also like how it started can move around a lot. And so like stepping back from, this is kind of what we sort of touched on right at the beginning around like not reaching for hope, like don't assert things to be facts if they're not, and like design a clearance process that allows for ambiguity in like what the answers to questions are. This last piece, actually deleted it in August last year from my presentations because it sounded so trite. And then we had Optus V2, where they sent a spokesperson out to do 2 GB, I think it was, where they laughed about the fact that a barber hadn't been able to transact for a whole day, and it basically had a day off. And like, how funny is that? People just need to calm down. And I think all of Australia like collectively took in a breath and were like, A, I can't believe that you would say that. And B, apparently only lizard people are capable of doing public comms for Optus. And so like, you know, we all learned yet more about some tricks to avoid. But I think the importance of just being really clear and deliberate internally about being genuine and sincere in your tone and being really accessible in the way that you write things. Like over and over again, we get these comms and they talk about like, if you like, you know, impacted individuals will be will be contacted, or it's like really corporate language. Like, we are aware of an incident. I hate that. Like really cold corporate speak. Like, you know what's better than impacted individuals? Like you. Like, no one wants to hear that you're aware of a cyber incident. They want to know that you're responding to a cyber incident. Like, just being more accessible and genuine in the way that you sort of describe the problem and your response to it, I think is so key. So I'll stop talking now.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. There's obviously a lot in it. Just one more question before we go to the questions from the group. And I know we've got a couple coming in there now, so please keep them coming in. What is the hardest decision that comms people need to make in a cyber incident?
every time, same hardest decision everywhere I go is like the decision to go public for the first time. Once you've gone public for the first time, organizations in the comms work, particularly in the comms work stream, tend to enter what I call BAU crisis, because suddenly all the processes work and the whole system's clicked in. And if you've gone external, it's because you've managed to brief all your people and suddenly all of your internal resources have been unlocked, and you're able to bring people along that journey. But the decision to go public, particularly if you're going public early, that is like the only time I ever see people yell at each other in a cyber incident. Like no other reason for bad behavior is the only time we see it. And so the trick, I suppose, to like avoiding the unnecessary frosty exchange with colleagues and others at like 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, as was a few weeks ago, is to think like, have a go now at understanding what your triggers to go public would be. They're different for everybody, but they tend to be between like 5 and 7, but no more than 7 for most organizations. Most people will go.
Sorry, what do you mean by 5 and 7?
Oh, sorry, five to 7 triggers, like reasons to go public that you can sort of document now. And the reason to do that is because I've never met an organization who doesn't say that their risk appetite for brand damage is not low. So everyone says like it's low or very low, but that can mean really different things to different parts of your business. Some people say it's really low, so I would go early and start to manage expectations and narrative. Other people say it is low, so I would never go public and I would just no comment everything. And you only discover that at the breakpoint moment when you're trying to convince people of the reason to go public at all. And so for a lot of organizations, like top of the list of like the reasons to go public, like we have been ransomware and we can't deliver a core service. And they're like, for that reason, we would that would initiate a waterfall that includes public comms and large scale comms to our people.
Perfect.
For other people, they say like if we discover systems have been accessed, which is an incredibly low bar. And that's where we get into the risk appetite of different organizations. So Medibank did disclose their incident when they knew when they knew they'd experienced unauthorized access, but well before they knew there'd been data theft. Yeah. Most people would say, you're mad, I'm not disclosing if there's been unauthorized access to my environment. That happens every week. I'm going to wait until I know whether or not sensitive systems have been accessed, or if I've seen data leave the environment, which means we might be in the frame for like a data breach notification to government. So we may as well start managing that narrative. Everyone's got kind of like a different risk profile. If you're dealing with hospitals, again, like it's a different kind of conversation. Like you kind of exist on this continuum of like, oh no, I can't buy like my pants that are on sale, like right through to like, oh, actually these people operate like water services or like, emergency rooms, and somewhere on there, like most organizations will fit between like I'll be really upset that I can't buy these pants on sale, and like actually we're gonna have to have a serious conversation about whether or not heart transplants can go ahead tomorrow. And like we've done the full gamut, right? So everyone will have a risk appetite and a set of triggers aligned to that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So it sounds like we all need to go do a fair bit of rethinking. But before we do that, we do have time for questions. So we've got a question here from Paige. Her question is, speaking of your earlier point of not needing to flex a new muscle in a reactive scenario, can you please talk about a reactive cyber incident where a planned media or comms tactic didn't hold up as planned and how you pivoted? Hoping this hasn't happened for you, but definitely keeps her awake at night. So over to you.
So we did have a client who issued comms, like against our advice, that made claims about whether like what kind of cyber incident they were experiencing, like how big it was and how long it would take them to like fully recover. And as the incident evolved, it became clear that it was like much worse than they had previously thought. Internally, there was a real like breaking point because people who had made the decision, I think, to go public with that narrative suddenly felt like they were on the back foot. And that is like, never want to put executives in a corner. Like it's a really dangerous place to be, particularly when you need everyone to be like operating at their best on like day 5 when no one has seen their family for 5 days. And so we could tell that we were like in danger of losing the confidence of like people in the public, regulators, parts of government, and investors. And so we initiated what we called the reset strategy. where we took a whole bunch of information that we had deliberately not released about the incident. So we had a lot more visibility of what was going on, particularly like who was responsible, so the criminal group responsible, and how the incident had begun, and partly because how the incident had begun was like particularly fascinating. Like I really like, obviously I'm a person who gets excited about this stuff. It's a bit of niche, but we took that information and we like selectively briefed a number of journalists to buy back the goodwill by bringing them in the tent and giving them an exclusive briefing. So I think I spent 9 hours on the phone that day, just sort of like briefing this narrative out. The other thing that did was inject like renewed certainty. It allowed us to position the organization as like knowing what they were doing. Like they may have messed up the beginning, but now like all the processes were in place. Like they knew how this happened. We knew who was responsible. Like we were sort of seeking to like right the ship, I suppose. And so that goes to like not disclosing information just because you've got it, and not committing to people that you'll tell them because you've got it. You want to hold some stuff back in case it looks like the media narrative is running against you. So you've got something new to say. But also we were really careful not to deploy any of that information until we knew that the threat actor had been evicted from the environment and couldn't get back in, because we couldn't go to the media and say like, here's how they got in. Because if the threat actor still had access to the environment, they could have like built themselves back doors to get in. And so you don't want to be like jeopardizing the technical response with your comms response too early. So that's one of the reasons why we say, you know, like be really careful about whether or not you say things are contained. Be really careful about telling people how things may or may not have happened. Legal teams hate talking about how something started because it can go to like liability and fault and like what went wrong. Usually something went wrong. Someone didn't pay an invoice for a piece of tech, or something wasn't configured the way that it was supposed to be. Like usually there's been a failure in process, but sometimes that can be a really like, you know, the creation of legal risk can be offset or like, you know, mitigated through like the long-term benefit to the brand. And that's why, you know, all three of those things being in tension, there's never a right answer. What we're looking for here is like the least worst answer. It's like the most depressing version of like those books that you used to have when you were a kid. It was like, am I doing the snake pit? Or like, they're like the
Oops, sorry, we lost you, Megan. Not
sorry, I don't know
quite sure what's happened there.
Yeah, sorry. We're just trying to find the least bad decision, I suppose, is like the key thing there.
Okay, cool. I have a question here from Jody. If we were to look at case studies or examples of a good response versus a bad response and lessons learned, what would you suggest to look at? And thanks for a great session.
All right, room for opportunity responses. Like as far as like recent examples. God, I hope no one here works for any of these people, but I'd be having a look at MediSecure as an opportunity to improve. MediSecure have been in the press in the last couple of weeks. They are a business who, until November last year, if you went to your doctor and they said, don't worry, I'm not going to print you off a script, I'll send you a text. They were like one of the providers who were behind that sort of like text prescription piece. Earlier this year, they experienced a significant cybersecurity event. And didn't go public about it. They are the first victim, as far as we know, who've been outed by government. So the government issued a statement saying they were aware of a healthcare organisation responding to a cybersecurity incident. And so what that then triggered, because obviously the media were hot onto that, it triggered this thing where like every single healthcare company in Australia came out and said it wasn't them until only MediSecure were holding the bag. MediSecure then released a statement which had clearly been written 3 days earlier, because it included the date from 3 days earlier, where they sort of demonstrated that they'd known but hadn't told anybody. They pointed the finger at a third party. I don't know, like for many reasons, like if we were to go through that that kind of like 10 rules to live by sheet before, it would just be like a clanger for sort of more than half of those. They subsequently issued sort of 2 other sets of comms, and they're now in administration and facing like significant like legal proceedings. So like lost the confidence of government, lost the confidence of consumers, and ultimately will probably not exist in like a year's time. So it's a sad case, but probably pertinent. They didn't have comms people working on that because I went looking after, and they had a significant legal team, and so that whole thing around like legal risk, strategic risk, technical risk, like the need for all those things to be in healthy tension is so key here.
Mm.
An example of what good looks like, I don't know if people followed the St. Vincent's hack over Christmas and New Year last year. I think they're what good looks like, partly because I was there, and they're like really excellent folks. And if people are looking for some more people to talk to, happy to connect people directly with their team. They went out, they had like clearly articulated milestones about what would trigger them to communicate. We hit a milestone. We communicated. None of their comms at the beginning were longer than 8 sentences long. And for me, like, I just can't stand comms, either to your staff, like, or to patients or your people, that are these like 1.5-page long, like, treatise on like cybersecurity and like we're victims and like why did this happen to us? And St. Vincent's was everything but that. Like, it was really clear, like very simple, very flat, focused on what they were doing, not what on they knew. So focused on what they were doing, not on what they knew. I think like they are like a classic example, and all their statements are still available on the website. And I'd encourage people to go and have a look at that. Another example of good in the last year. So DP World, a business no one had ever heard of unless you work in logistics and supply chain management. They operate 40% of Australia's maritime freighting operation. They manage like Port of Brisbane, also Fremantle, Melbourne, and Botany Bay, and also Port in the Northern Territory. This is all a matter of the public record, but they saw inside their like monitoring system, their cyber monitoring system, that there was unauthorized access externally into the environment, and made a call that the current way their environment was configured, they weren't going to be able to shut that down quickly, given they didn't know what that person was up to, what they were looking for, or what they were capable of.
Mm-hmm.
And so they, a senior executive made the like unilateral decision to turn off the internet and disconnect the whole business from the internet, and in doing so brought 40% of Australia's maritime freight to a crashing halt, and then picked up the phone to his head of corporate affairs and was like, I think we need to tell some people that I've just done this thing. And so that was like a massive communications response. And at the beginning, they were going to be blamed for everything from like the next interest rate rise to cancelling Christmas. I think we made them some like Grinch stickers after we saved Christmas and got them kind of all back up and running. But again, that was, they're both examples, I think, of what good looks like. And partly it's because like no one remembers DP World. People, unless you're like in healthcare, like pretty uninterested in what happened at St. Vincent's. And I think one of the questions we get most often from people, like particularly senior executives, like, aren't people bored of cybersecurity events? Like, do we even need to like tell people about it? And my thing is like, no one is bored of a poorly managed crisis, but you can make people bored of a well-managed one. And so like what we need to do is like make cybersecurity incidents boring again. And so like, and part of that, right, is just having like these like good practice processes and giving your teams the opportunity to sort of talk about it in advance.
Great, thank you. They're really good examples. Okay, we've got time for a couple more. So this one's from Blake. What level of reactive press by an official spokesperson, for example, a CEO or director, is appropriate? So for example, for transparency, must we agree to every request for radio, TV, interviews, or are statements sufficient and followed up case by case?
Yep. So my view would be for the first 48 hours, statements are sufficient. And I would never put a spokesperson, regardless of how media trained they are, in front of like live media, so either radio or a camera, before you have your first piece of good news. So I don't really care what that piece of good news is. Like, we can sparkle up just about anything, but usually the first piece of good news is like, this incident has been contained, which means the threat actor no longer has access, which means now we're more able to understand what our pathway out of this looks like. And you can start to give people some certainty around like service restoration and kind of like getting things back to BAU. I would say there will be calls, particularly if you're like government or one of those other 3 categories I mentioned before. So ASX listed, large B2C or critical infrastructure. There'll be like calls for you to do media. No client of mine has ever done a press conference. I'm a huge believer in what I call like staggered press conferences, where you invite all of the TV outlets 25 minutes apart, and your CEO does like individual sort of like interviews, essentially, like over and over and over and over again. And like, this is the thing from COVID, like what happens when the press pack gets together? It's like a massive pile on. What happens when you're just talking to a journalist, like one-to-one? It's much more respectful. There's much less of a pile-on. And actually what you tend to get, the same 7 questions over and over and over and over and over again. Because what are people really trying to get? Like their grab, right, for the news package.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, manage it all on a case-by-case basis. Don't do media that doesn't suit you. Fight internally to get the piece of good news, like without putting undue pressure on your technical colleagues who are already putting enough pressure on themselves. And then sort of like, fly from there.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you. Question from Rebecca. How do you go about gauging what leaders' appetite or what are leaders' appetite for risk? So in my previous experience, I've seen what they say their appetite is in planning is different to when you're actually in a crisis. It's a really good question, Beck.
Yep, and totally accurate. And I think that goes to that piece before where everyone says, oh, my risk appetite's really low, but that means really different things to people. It can mean like different things to the CEO, your head of legal, the chair of the board, like all of those people are key stakeholders in setting the comms risk appetite. And I think the tool I use to try and normalize that and get it out of people is like trying to codify those triggers to go public. Because actually once you put like a hard example in front of someone, that's when you get like, oh no, well that seems much too early. I'm not even gonna, like, I would not even consider that. And you would say, that's so interesting. Like we can have not like the row, but like we can have like the debate now about like, well, here are the comms reasons to go. Understand there are like legal or technical or other reasons not to, but let's like document that.
Love it.
And form a view at a senior level about that, and then send it to the board. Like let the board have a look. Like there's no management who hasn't told me the board won't be involved in running a cyber incident. There's no board I've worked with in the middle of a cyber incident who hasn't decided it's their time to shine. So like giving the board visibility of that as well is like so key. Like do that now is key to making sure that you can fly like leanly and meanly in that case.
Love it. Or nicely, leanly and nicely.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never have been able to fly nicely in the first 48 hours, but
that's true. Yes.
We get to nice reappears around like BAU crisis.
We'll keep that in mind. Last question from Jody. Hi, Megan. Do you have any advice on running a simulation to test your cyber crisis comms processes or plans? And how often should teams do this ideally?
Yeah. So I'll probably start with how often. Really depends on the kind of organization you sit inside of. So if you're like in one of those 3, and so ASX listed, large B2C or critical infrastructure, like annually, like I'd really encourage you to think about doing that annually. If you are like a much smaller organization, like I'm sure we're joined today by colleagues who are the only comms person, or like they've got one other person who works with them in their team. Instead of running like a dedicated comms, tabletop discussion, decision-making exercise, what you really want to do is make sure that comms is included in the organizational tabletop exercise that's probably occurring on either an annual or biannual basis. Like, don't feel like you have to go it alone. If you are a larger org that's got resources, like, giving your people the opportunity to test annually, I think is key. The threat landscape is moving around like we have never seen it devolve as quickly as we have in the last 2 years. Like the shape of the criminal economy has like fundamentally changed. It used to be that we would see like traditional like cybercrime gangs, like, like people sort of sometimes talk about like the mafia, like established gangs. And we've moved into something more like what I describe as like an Ocean's 11 model, where you have like specialists who come together to execute a job and then go and work with different sets of people. Like that shift has like almost fundamentally occurred just in the last 18 months to 2 years. And it's the same on the regulatory and comms front as well. So we're dealing with this like deteriorating cyber threat landscape compounded by like an escalating threat landscape on the media, regulatory and comms front. So between those 2 things, I think like if you're a big org, and annually is the minimum. They're actually a lot of fun. Sometimes people say like, I want people to be really stressed out during an exercise. I want to simulate what it's going to feel like. And I'm like, unless you can give me your people for like 2 weeks, and all we do is this, like we can't simulate. All we can do is like bring pressure into the room, by getting people to contemplate like some really awful things that we know other people, like peer organizations, have had to contemplate and sort of like solution their way through, and do it in a really like methodical way, and in a way that gives people an opportunity to ask like every dumb question they never had about cybersecurity, and like how peers and others are kind of responding to it. The pressure comes naturally when you're dealing with a group of like professional individuals who know like what will be at stake in the event of an actual incident. You need your like culture of your team to bring that. Like you can't ask externals to bring that for you. But I think they are. Like I say, like at the end of it, like they're quite good fun, and usually people say, "I've really enjoyed that, and I hope we'd never meet ever again." Which I hope, I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes to the hour, is like hopefully not the takeaway for most people today. Yeah.
Great. Well, speaking of takeaways, let's wrap this up with one last question. What is one thing that you think would shift the dial for most people on this call that they should go away and do after this webinar?
Go and pull down your crisis comms plan, and have a think about like whether or not this would survive like first contact with the enemy. I know like there's that expression about like everyone has a plan till you get punched in the face, like only if it's not a very good plan. So like actually go away and have a read of it. Like if you're in government, like reach out to the CSU. They're a really capable team and like really great to work with and really collaborative. And if you're like a business more broadly in Queensland, selfishly, I'd like to say we're here to help you. But yeah, like go away and think really holistically about whether or not like whatever processes and people are described, like A, do all those people still work in your organization? Like B, is that actually how your muscle movement works inside your org, or is this some sort of like perfect process that's been described that
Utopia.
actually works? Yep.
Yeah.
And then like how would you make that more robust, and robust enough for the inevitable?
Yeah, love it. One of the things I love with doing with crisis comms planning, or even just project planning, is doing the pre-mortem. So if we failed, why would we have failed?
Yep.
And work your way back from there. And that can really, that question in of itself, when looking at your comms plan, can actually go, if we failed, what would be the reasons? Well, we need to plug those gaps.
And there are plenty of people who can help you. Like there's no industry in Queensland or anywhere else that hasn't got a peer organization who hasn't already done this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, already failed, right? So like talk to your technical teams, like even organizations that haven't disclosed publicly, like no one gossips harder than a cybersecurity professional. They all know. They're on like 1,000 WhatsApp chats and they all know. And so like go and meet peers who've done this in your industry. People are willing to share because they want to make sure that no one else gets kind of like stuck in that 4 p.m. on a Friday spot that they were in. I find people are really generous with their time and insight.
Speaking of being very generous with your time and insight, Megan, thank you so much for today. There was so much gold in that. We will be sharing the recording with people who bought tickets. So if you need to refresh, because there was so much there, absolutely look out for that. And if you have any other questions or anything for Megan, I'm sure she'll happily respond when she can. She's a very busy woman, as you can imagine, but you can find her on LinkedIn. And I think we have all gotten so much out of that. So thank you again, Megan. And hopefully we'll see you all at our next event in August, which is it's a case study on Queensland Government, actually, a department who brought together different teams and managed to merge them really beautifully, and how internal comms played a part in that. Thanks again, everybody. Have a beautiful day.
Thanks, guys.